My name is Ben Wellington. I'm a visiting professor at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, but I also write a blog, and that's why I'm here today. It's called iQuant New York. And I use open data and public data to make change in the city I live in, not as a journalist, but as a citizen of that city. So I'm going to tell you stories today about how I've done some data storytelling in order to get government to change how it operates. Before I do that, I'm going to go into a little bit what is driving change through open data and talk a little about open data. Open data is this idea that data is public by default. Imagine if all data collected by your company or by the government was public, unless there's a reason for it not to be. Right now, it's all private unless somebody forces it out. But let's turn that on its head. Imagine if it's default public. That creates a lot of opportunity. That's what open data is about. I would say that it really kicked off more heavily in the first full day of President Obama's presidency, and he signed this memo that said government should be transparent, participatory, and collaborative. Now, people talk about open data as transparency. They talk about, oh, we want transparency in government, open data is all, but they miss these other parts, collaboration and participation, and I'm going to tell you about how I use that to change New York City. Off the back of this, about a few months afterwards, the United States launched data.gov, which is one of the first national data portals. At the time, it had 47 data sets. Today, it has, well, actually, as of yesterday, it had 304,000 data sets on data.gov, where people in the United States and anyone in the world can start to explore. It's not just a US thing. Obviously, it's expanded globally. The Open Knowledge Foundation maps the open data score for countries around the world. And the way they do that is they rank it by what types of data they have and whether they're publicly available, whether they're free, whether they're machine readable, and then they take all this and they make scores and rank these countries, and Taiwan is currently the most open and transparent data portal in the world. But of course, here in United Arab Emirates, they have an open data set as well, sporting 884 data sets as of yesterday. I did a quick look, and just to show you the diversity of open data, check out the first data set here. Number of sheep by emirate, gender, and age. Number of sheep is the first data set on the data. So the data goes everywhere. You always wonder, why is that there? Well, I'm going to tell you why in a bit. For me, my story started when New York City in 2012 passed open data legislation. That's Mayor Bloomberg. What he said at the time was, across city government, agencies use data to develop policy, implement programs, and track performance. And each month, our administration shares more and more of the data with the public at large, catalyzing the creativity, intellect, and enterprising spirit of computer programmers to build tools that help us all improve our lives. Computer programmers, right? So what do we do next? We built apps. We have this thing in New York called the Big Apps Competition, because if we build apps and give people data, they'll change our lives, right? That's the way people tend to also think about data, either transparency or apps. And this always struck me, Mayor Bloomberg saying that open data was about the spirit of computer programmers. It's not. It's about the spirit of everyone. It's about journalists. It's about nonprofits. It's about policymakers. Everyone has access to information. You don't need to be a computer programmer to do something with open data, right? You just need to be able to count things and maybe sum them. And I'm going to show you that. So take a step back. This is the kind of chart that you'd see often from a government agency. This in New York, this is from many years ago, but the idea is that it's just counting cars. How many taxis were there? How many black cars? How many limos? These are from licenses, right? And it's the kind of chart you see all over. But did you ever think about every chart you see has a narrative? Journalists know that, right? Every single graph, every chart was somebody's narrative on a raw data set. Somebody decided this was what I want you to see. But with open data, you build your own narrative. You're no longer being fed, right? You can actually open it up and see. This is a lot of information here, not on the set, but behind it. For example, we have 13,000 taxis in New York City. Every taxi has a GPS recorder. Every time they pick up someone and drop someone off, they record that. They know how long the ride was. And what do? We count them? Not interesting. I had a question. My question was, when is rush hour in New York City? Well, great, we have all these taxis running around. Let's just look at their speeds. We know when they drop people off. We know when they pick them up. We know how long it took. Distance equals rate times time. I think I remember that from studying. So we can do that, and I got this plot. Turns out that taxis in New York are going fastest at 5:18 in the morning, where they're going an amazing 39 kilometers per hour on average. And it drops at 8:35 in the morning. They're going an average of 18 kilometers per hour. That's the average speed of the entire taxi fleet. And it stays that way all day. Turns out there's no rush hour in New York City, just rush day, which was kind of interesting finding. Taking this is not the kind of chart you'd see on a government agency's website, but you can ask these questions. You can literally see from my neighborhood to the airport, what the average trip at 3:30 p.m., how long it should take on average with some sort of error bars, right? You can start to really get all this information if the data is public, And let me tell you a story about this data. It wasn't public when it first came out, right? This is called a Freedom of Information Law request form put out by the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York City. Journalists are nodding. There are freedom of information laws around the world in different countries to varying degrees. In New York, this is actually a little bit, at least they give you a form to fill out. And this guy, Chris Wong, filled out the form, and they said, just bring your hard drive down unopened to the office, and we can give you the data. So he does that. And you know what he does with the data? He puts it on the internet, much to the surprise of the government agency. Wait, but it's public. The fact that it can be released via FOIL means it's public. And I challenge all journalists and all academics, and really anyone who gets access to data, to put it online. We're seeing that out of certain news agencies. The New York Times is being very progressive in that space. You see 538, who's data journalists. You see it less so in larger institutions. A lot of them, they take data and they hoard it. They file the freedom of information. Oh, it's my, at least with your story, put out your data set, because you know what? People can check your work, and you might learn something, right? So let's get our data out there in the public. Another graph, this is just me messing around learning software called GIS. This is not a very pretty graph. It was me for my own information, studying where bicycle accidents happen in New York City. And I happen to bike from across one of these rivers, and I can see the sort of sea of red, which is a little scary. Those are where there are more collisions. But in order to do this, this is an area of Brooklyn, and there's this street called Roosevelt Avenue in Queens, which is known to be, in New York City, which is known to be very dangerous. And you can see it kind of pop just by playing with the data. But this data was not public when I looked at it. You know where it came from? You ever seen one of these? Who knows that logo, huh? You know that logo, right? It's great. So PDF is where data goes to die, okay? PDF is a fortress against public data use. And it turns out that the New York Police Department would just release these PDFs. They were by regulation, they had to release the data. But if you have to release the data and you don't want anyone to use it, what do? PDF it, right? So they took raw data and they wrote it to PDF files. And I'm not kidding, hundreds of pages of a table in PDF file was posted on their website each month, listing every collision in New York City, the street it was on, how many people were injured, in a PDF file. Clearly starting as raw data. Clearly somebody was clearly wanted someone not to use this data. Well, this guy, John Krause, made something called the New York Police Department Crash Data Band-Aid. And it would go to the New York Police Department's website every day, look for PDFs, and if it found one, download it and make a CSV or machine readable on his own website. It would mirror it. And suddenly the data was public, and I was able to use it. Now, in both these cases, about a year after the public made the data available, the government agency followed suit. Right? Once the cat's out of the bag, as they say, or the genie's out of the bottle, there's no turning back. So the way that people are getting government to open up data is to open it up for them, for the agency to realize, oh, it's not so bad, and we should own this process, right? We should control this. And then a year or two later, they tend to do that. Another big area that we're seeing a lot of new data in the last year or two is in crime. This is a chart of robberies in New York City. Robbery means somebody comes up and takes something from you by force, right? Whether they're hurting you or not, or grabbing it out of your hand. I always assumed, living in a city, that most robberies happen late at night. I figure you're walking around, it's very late. It turns out 3 p.m., 1,500 hours. That's when the most robberies in New York City are happening. This is the first time we as citizens can see this, because up until now, they only would release monthly counts per precinct. Most people around the world, most police agencies around the world release counts per geographical area. This month, there were this many of this crime. There were this many murders. You can't do anything with that information. It's so abstracted out. But with open data, you can. You can ask any question you want. I had a theory. You know what happens at 3 p.m. in the afternoon? School gets out. So I said, OK, well, let me split this by school holidays and when kids are in school. Blue line, kids are in school. Red line, kids are not in school. Both weekdays during the same times of the year. What do we learn? We learn that this big uptick is caused by kids getting out of school. Now, that's all we know. There's a lot more question of why and how. But it opens up interesting policy questions that we can start to actually ask, even locally. I can run this in my neighborhood. I can run this in a different area. If I'm doing after-school programming and I want to know which neighborhood to target, I can actually now go look. Right? That's what open data allows us to do. For the first time, by the way, because this is only in the hands of our government until recently. And this is internationally. All around the world, we're seeing this. This is the participation I'm talking about that is missing today in open data. It's a cultural shift, because most people think they release data, it's dangerous. Oh, what are they going to do with it? They want to hide and stay, and it's very nerve-wracking to open up. And it turns out that you can do interesting things. So the next examples I'm going to show you are ways that I've gotten New York to start interacting with me by writing up a little story on a blog, and analyzing data, posting it, letting the media find it, write a story, and then having the government respond to the media. Okay? So I'll bring you through a bunch of these examples, just pouring through New York City data sets and finding interesting things. First slide on that front. This is called New York City Restaurant Health Inspections. In New York, all the restaurants are inspected, and they get 3 grades, A, B, or C. If you're very clean, you get an A, or a B if it's not as clean, and then C, and then it goes downhill. Turns out that this is violation points. So the inspectors go in. If you get 1 through 13 violation points, you get an A. 14 through 27, you get a B. And this letter sits in your window. Big, right when you walk in, you have to display it. So everyone knows they're walking into a C restaurant. That's not good for business. That's how they get restaurants to clean up. OK, turns out if you count the number of restaurants that get each score, you get this chart. You see what happens is green is 13, and then it turns to blue at 14. How do all these restaurants get exactly the lowest A possible? These are 1- and 2-point violations. How are they all just barely getting an A, and then no one's getting a high B? Why are there 4 times more 13s than there are 14s? Why? Because the inspectors are human, and they use discretion, and they feel bad, I assume, or maybe, I can't tell you why. I don't have the answer why. You can imagine why. There's something wrong with this system. I wrote about it, and the Department of Health in New York City responded, inspectors are not instructed to offer leniency just to cite what they see. The final score is based on the extent of the violations the inspector observed. So they really didn't say anything useful. But if you had this data in full form, you could make one of these charts per inspector. Right? Every inspector has one of these charts, and you could right away know who's doing this. Unfortunately, they don't release that column. There's no column inspector ID, so they could fix this. I told them this 4 years ago. Nothing has changed. So we'll see where that goes. Other things that I've found in New York are when you ride a New York City taxi and you get out, at the end of the ride, you're offered an option in true American form. Would you like to tip 20%, 25%, or 30%? Those are your 3 options, or other, right? So now, they're hoping you click on, they could have said 10 or 15 or 20, but they said 20, 25, or 30. Most people click 20, turns out, or the buttons. They don't want to hit other. They don't want to type things in. It's just easy. But did anyone ever stop and think about 20% of what? Right? Because there's different options. If you wrote a cab program by Creative Mobile Technologies, it was 20% of your fare, of any surcharges, of your tolls. Like if you go over a bridge and it costs $10, you're tipping on top of that, and taxes. But if you rode a taxi program by Verifone, it was 20% of your surcharge and fare. And it turned out that drivers who happen to have different software in the back of their cabs were making $350 more a year on average because of the number of people who just click the buttons. $350 more a year just because they have a different manufacturer. Now, this is a highly regulated industry in New York City. The way we pay, taxis are incredibly regulated. So I wrote about this, and I got my favorite government, it went into the news wrote about it, and I got my favorite government quote of all time. I'll share that with you. We appreciate that work that went into his analysis, and we're giving it a thorough read. Now, 3 weeks later, they reprogrammed half the fleet of taxis in New York. Today, all New Yorkers tip on top of tolls and taxes, so it backfired a little bit. But at least it's uniform. At least we're fixing problems in the system. We see the New York Police Department using Twitter, and we get tweets like this. The 5th Precinct had a 115% increase in bicycle collisions this year. Police officers will be enforcing violations by bicyclists. #bike space safety. OK. This is interesting. First of all, 115% increase in anything is crazy. More than double of anything. You don't really see things like that unless there's like a volcano that opened up or something strange. But second of all, imagine a world where government had to show their work. I have to in school. Why can't our government agencies release a little, they must have done some analysis. Can't they release a little notebook or piece of code or something? I mean, it's not crazy. That's not science fiction. Somebody did this analysis. Can they share it? They're not right now, but we should be. To gain trust, right? We should be. And I went and I redid this analysis, and it turned out there was a decrease in collisions in that neighborhood in that same time. So they're tweeting, they're sending out officers, but it was just wrong. That time, the New York Police Department didn't say anything. Not surprising. I'll give you a few more examples. For the first time in history in New York City, and many other cities now are following suit, or even predated that, are releasing their budgets in machine-readable form. Okay? So in other words, instead of just giving you a PDF file with the whole budget, you can actually see every item, you can slice it, you can dice it. And this is not only the first time for the public, but it turns out it's the first time for our legislators. If you voted on the budget in New York City, you were given a giant book that you had to vote yes or no on. You couldn't actually sort things, understand things. So the first thing I did when it came out was look at the #1 expenses of the New York Police Department, okay? And it turns out, it's hard to see, but it says that they were spending $791 million protecting foreign missions. 791, more than the sum of almost all the programs. It was the most expensive thing. Didn't make any sense, and I realized quickly that it was a typo. And it was in the raw documents, and the mayor's office put out a statement, though it appears in budget documents made public, it does not affect actual operations or monetary allocations. Now think about this. They voted on this, they said yes, it went into, this typo made it through the entire process. The largest expense, a $700 million typo. Why? Because we're not empowering our government officials to use data, right? How did this make it through? Because everyone looks at what they care about. Nobody stopped and said, what is this 791 thing? So it made it all the way through, and that's emblematic of the problems that A, open data can help, because we can crowdsource some of this, and B, we should also be empowering our own civil servants to use data to not have things like this happen. My last 2 examples are about something that many people don't love. This is a map of fire hydrants in New York City, right? Fire hydrants, they're this big. If you park within 3 meters of any fire hydrant, you get a parking ticket. It's a $185 ticket, plus your car gets towed away, and it's another $200 to get it back. So it's about $350, $400 if you park within 3 meters of any hydrant anywhere in the city. There's no sign, you just have to know that. Just memorize it, okay? So I was curious, which hydrants make the most money for New York, right? Every hydrant has a revenue. So I mapped them, and it turned out that in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there's a lot of tickets. But what was more fascinating were these 2 hydrants in the Lower East Side that every year were making over $55,000 a year just being fire hydrants. They were making more than minimum wage in the United States by being a fire hydrant, right? Something was clearly wrong. And yet our government didn't see this because they're not looking at the data, right? They're not always looking at the data. So open data can help with that. I wrote about this, and it turns out that there was a hydrant and then like a lane for biking or walking, and then a parking spot. And technically the car was not appropriately far away, so they got ticketed. And if you go on Google Street View, you can see the little orange tickets on all the cars in the pictures, which is kind of fun. So the Department of Transportation responded, well, we have not received any complaints about this location. We will review the roadway markings and make any appropriate alterations. So I waited 3 weeks, came back, got the streets repainted. Little win, right? So we're starting to see a dialogue between citizens and government making actual local change. Now, is this a huge deal? No, but we can apply this to crime if they release the data. We can apply this, how can we make our garbage delivery more efficient, right? Your citizens want government to be more efficient. Well, what if you let them in? What if you change the culture so that you're not embarrassed by this? And I'm going to show you my last example, which is also a parking thing. It turns out that this is a pedestrian ramp here. And you can see that there's ramps that allow you to walk onto the street in New York. And it turns out you actually can park there. It's legal, as long as there's no crosswalk or stop sign. The problem is the police don't know this, or didn't. All right, so I would park in one of these, and I would get a ticket, and I would say not guilty, and I write my reason, and I lost. And then I appealed, and I lost. And then I was very frustrated, so I downloaded every single parking ticket in New York City, and I showed that the top 200 places where people got this particular type of ticket were all legal. In other words, all these tickets were invalid. So I showed New York City police were giving $2 to $3 million a year to legally parked cars. But you know what I did differently this time? I used my connections that I built by doing this work, and I reached out to government, and I said, I'm going to write this in 30 days. And I said, so let me know what you want to do. Most people don't have that option. I happen to have built up a relationship with the city because of my work, and they knew me. But imagine a world where we actually could interact with the government, right? It doesn't have to happen through the media. It doesn't have to. So this time, when I went to write about it, the New York Police Department, unlike last time, had a statement ready. Mr. Wellington's analysis identified errors the department made in issuing parking summonses. It appears to be a misunderstanding by officers on patrol of a recent abstruse change in the parking rules. We appreciate Mr. Wellington bringing this anomaly to our attention. And you know what they did? They retrained all their officers, they issued refunds, and they made sure that it would stop happening. Now, I want to point out that everything I've just shown you uses these operators. I counted, I averaged, I summed. This is not crazy, right? This is basic, but it's what the future can be in a world where data becomes, where our citizens become more data literate as we push education down to, hey, in middle school you should learn math and science and data, right? We're getting there. We're not quite there, but we're getting there. I teach urban planners at Pratt who have no computer background, and they take data sets like this, which is the collisions, and they can make now diagrams about around their neighborhood, what's happening, what kind of accidents are happening the most often, right? These are people who have These are not programmers. This is for everyone. And even high schoolers, without any data experience, we're taking data sets, and hey, that you can use colored pencils, right? We're getting there. You can map out graffiti in New York City. So my point in here, this is not some futuristic thing, and it's not, oh, you need to be the most computer model, this, that. You don't need AI to do problems like this. There's a lot you can do with AI, but this starts with descriptive statistics. This starts with looking at things. And by the way, you take any data set and you look at an outlier, there's usually a story. Any data set, the most anything, either it's bad data or a good story. The least anything, the most productive taxi driver, the most parking tickets, the most anything is an interesting story. So that's one way to explore data. So with that, I hope I've convinced you that open data is an important direction in government, that there's a lot of opportunity, and that really anyone can participate in this sort of back and forth, either as a journalist or just as someone interested in changing government. Thank you.